This Feeling by LeilahMoon, read by Ella Max Mabella. Chapter 20. Hermione had a tendency to detach herself from difficult moments and go into planning mode, which was how she ended up leant against Draco, scribbling in a notebook, unaware that he would rather think about almost anything else.
"If you are quite done brainstorming ideas for how to kill but not actually kill Dumbledore," he said eventually, "could we please stop for a while?"
She looked at him consideringly. There was still numerous things they hadn't discussed yet, but she could appreciate his request. A familiar heat crept into her cheeks as her mind drifted to ways she might be able to distract him. This did not go unnoticed. It wasn't a fantastic timing, she thought, as Draco lowered them to the ground, his body covering hers, but it had been a long slumber.
"Granger,"
he growled, his breath hot against her ear.
"Stop thinking."
Hermione pushed her lips roughly against his, biting his bottom lip, suddenly feeling a desperate need to be as close to him as possible. His hand slipped up her skirt and cupped her core. He swallowed her moan. Pushing aside the damp material, he slid one finger and then another inside of her. She grappled with his shirt, tearing at the buttons as he pumped in and out of her, the pad of his thumb rubbing her clit. He took one hand off her breast to pull his arm free from the sleeve and instantly realized his mistake. Hermione had stood, her eyes wide. There, branded into his skin, was the dark mark. Obviously, she had known it was there. He had told her just a few hours ago, but seeing it felt different, real. Now she couldn't pretend that what Draco had gone through was simply an awful dream. He burned with shame and turned away from her, whispering, "I'm sorry." Recovering quickly, Hermione sat up facing him and pulled the rest of his shirt off. She took his left arm in her hand and covered the mark with kisses. "He doesn't get to make you feel like you've done something wrong," she told him. "What this mark really represents is the love you have for your family and the sacrifices you're willing to make to keep them safe." Draco pulled her against him, his lips seizing hers. They kissed slowly and deeply. The frantic energy from earlier was gone. Hermione wanted every moment she made to convey how much she loved him. Moving to lie on the sofa, which had again kindly expanded, they unhurriedly removed their remaining articles of clothing. She ran her fingers down his back, wondering at how toned he felt. He pinned her down, attempting to kiss every part of her, sucking at her pulse point. A low groan tore from his throat as his hips positioned themselves perfectly between her thighs and heat pooled in her abdomen. Pressed his hard length against her core, and she whined involuntarily. "Draco, please!" Hermione swallowed. "I want you."
"Oh, are you sure?"
he rasped. "Yes, yes!" He slid his hand slowly down her torso to the apex of her thighs. Whimpering, she pushed her hips towards him as he stroked her slowly, testing her wetness, fingers trailing along her slit. "Please," she begged. "Tell me if it hurts." She nodded. He ran his eyes over her, committing each curve to memory. Gently nudging her legs farther apart, his body trembled as he aligned himself to her. Draco groaned as he pushed inside. He waited for her to adjust to the feeling of him before continuing. Hermione's face flicked with discomfort, and he froze. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Don't stop." Claiming his mouth again, she ran her tongue along his bottom lip, and he thrust further. Shuddering as he finally bottomed out, his pelvis flush against hers. He moved slowly, making her groan in anticipation, pulling back an inch and then pushing into her again.
"Hermione,"
he gasped, lengthening to long, slow strokes. She whimpered, her legs beginning to tremble. "Faster, please." His breathing hitched as he increased his pace, trailing kisses and nips along her skin, marking her. His gaze caught on her breasts as they bounced in time with his thrusts, and he dipped his head to capture her hot nipple in his mouth. The tension in her core wound steadily tighter, her back arched, and she kissed him furiously. Draco's hand slipped between them to circle her clit. It pushed her over the edge, and she came apart in his arms, her walls clenching tightly around him. He panted into her neck, his hands gripping her hips as he pumped hard and fast. His cock pulsed in time with her lingering aftershocks, and he poured himself into her. He collapsed on top of her, breathing heavily, and Hermione pulled him close. "I love you." They lay pressed together for a long time, basking in the afterglow of the experience they had shared. Cocooned in this way, it was easy to forget the world around them. Halfway through October came Hermione, Harry, and Ron's first trip of the term to Hogsmeade. It had, however, been a fairly dismal afternoon as they battled their way through sleet and bitterly cold winds to arrive at boarded-up shops and an overcrowded Three Broomsticks. On their way back to the castle, it had only gotten worse. Katie Bell and her friend Liane were arguing about something Katie was holding in her hands. They fought over the package which led to the Gryffindor chaser rising into the air, her arms outstretched, as though she were about to fly. Her hair was whipped around by the fierce wind, and she let out a terrible scream. Harry had gone for help and ran back with Hagrid, who lifted Katie into his arm and rushed towards the school. Hermione crouched down. An ornate opal necklace was visible, poking out of the brown paper packaging.
"I've seen that before," said Harry, staring at the thing. "It was in a case at Borgin and Burke's 4 years ago. Malfoy knows about it. This is what he was buying that day when we followed him. He remembered it and went back for it."
A cold shiver passed through Hermione as she, yet again, prayed Harry was wrong. Chapter 21. Draco's point of view. Draco sat by the lake with his head in his hands. It was freezing cold, and he was chilled to the bone. Katie Bell had been transferred to St. Mungo's, and, although she was still alive, he had come incredibly close to killing her. That hadn't been part of the plan. Theo had sought him out only a few days into term, realizing that something was wrong. Lucius had repeatedly told Draco how weak he was, and he supposed it must be true, because he had told Theo everything, and hated himself for it. They had come up with the cursed necklace plan together, fully aware of how flawed it was, but Draco knew he needed to prove to the Dark Lord that he had begun attempting his task. Theo had practiced the Imperious Curse on Draco over and over again until he could cast it perfectly. It was easy enough then for Theo to go into Hogsmeade as usual and cast the Unforgivable upon Madame Rosmerta, whilst Draco stayed in the castle for detention. They weren't sure whether the landlady would be able to Imperious someone else, but it had worked, and Katie Bell left the Three Broomsticks with the necklace. Draco received an owl a few days later. The Dark Lord had expected better. His mother was punished for his indiscretion. When he had visited Borgin and Burke's before the start of term, Draco hoped that fixing the twin vanishing cabinets would be a backup plan, but it was becoming clearer that he would have to start work on the one in the room of the hidden things immediately. It had been a challenge figuring out how he could spend hours at a time in the room without being noticed, particularly by Hermione. However, by stealing some Polyjuice potion from Slughorn, he had been able to set Crabbe and Goyle up as lookouts. Every step Draco took towards completing the task he'd been assigned, another wave of darkness washed over his insides. It was taking its toll on him. He felt anger and rage like he hadn't experienced in a long time, wanted to scream about how unfair it all was, but he couldn't, and he didn't. Hermione was the only thing keeping him afloat. When all he felt was pain and fear, he would lose himself in memories of her. He had relived their first time more often than he would ever admit. Draco never imagined he would be capable of loving someone so deeply, despite wondering how much time they would have left together. Christmas was approaching fast, snow swirling against the icy windows once more. Hagrid had already single-handedly delivered the usual 12 Christmas trees for the Great Hall. Garlands of holly and tinsel had been twisted around the banister of the stairs. Everlasting candles glowed from inside the helmets of suits of armor, and great bunches of mistletoe had been hung at intervals along the corridors. Hermione had become increasingly concerned about Draco. He sat alone at his Slytherin table most days, tired and pale, staring at his food rather than eating it. The boy who could usually be relied upon for some sort of dramatic entertainment or sarcastic comment had disappeared. The spark in him had been extinguished, and she longed for it back. They had been meeting infrequently, as he was usually busy with his task. Despite promising to keep her involved, Draco wouldn't give any details about what he was actually doing. She hadn't spoken to him about the cursed necklace for fear of breaking him further than he already was, but it scared her that it appeared he really was trying to accomplish Voldemort's ultimate goal. Loud singing broke Hermione's reverie as she remembered where she was. Slughorn's Christmas party. His office was much larger than the usual teacher's study. The ceiling and walls had been draped with emerald, crimson, and gold hangings, so that it looked as though they were all inside a vast tent. The room was crowded and stuffy and bathed in red lights, cast by an ornate golden lamp dangling from the center of the ceiling, in which real fairies were fluttering, each a brilliant speck of light. She leaned against the wall, observing the other guests. Slughorn was wearing a tasseled velvet hat to match his smoking jacket and paraded Harry around the room like a show pony. Suddenly, noticing Cormac McLaggen making his way towards her, licking his lips every now and then, Hermione shuddered and made to hide in the crowd.
"Harry, there you are! Thank goodness! Are you okay?"
he asked. She linked her arm with his and pulled him in the direction of the drinks table.
"Fina, you're here."
Picking up 2 goblets of mead, they turned to survey their room. Harry nudged her and said,
"Look who it is."
Draco was being dragged by the ear towards them by Argus Filch.
"Professor Slughorn?"
wheezed Filch, his jaws a-quiver and the maniacal light of mischief detection in his bulging eyes.
"I discovered this boy lurking in an upstairs corridor. He claims to have been invited to your party and to have been delayed in setting out. Did you issue him with an invitation?"
Pulling himself free of Filch's grip, Draco looked furious.
"Oh, right, I wasn't invited," he said angrily. "I was trying to gatecrash. Happy?"
Filch continued babbling with glee until Slughorn cut him off, waving a hand.
"It is quite all right, Argus. It's Christmas, and it's not a crime to want to come to a party. Just as once we forget any punishment. You may stay, Draco."
His face had a greyish tinge to it, and Hermione took a step towards him. It was only when he shook his head imperceptibly that she remembered herself.
"I'd like a word with you, Draco,"
said Snape suddenly.
"Oh, no, Severus,"
Slughorn cried.
"don't be too hard on the boy."
"I am his head of house,"
Snape replied coldly.
"Follow me, Draco."
They left, Snape leading the way. Harry stood frozen to the spot for a moment before hurrying off into the crowd. Hermione tried to follow, but he must have pulled his invisibility cloak out, as he was nowhere to be found. To be continued. Thank you for listening to today's chapters of This Feeling by LeilahMoon, read by Ella Max Mabella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, AO3, or Tumblr.